Well, hello everyone. Salamat sizbi, здравствуйте. And of course, this week, I should say now is Kutlubolsun. So on behalf of the British-Kazakh Society, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar, which is titled Kazakhstan, the Impact of Politics and Economy on the Energy Business. Two housekeeping items. The webinar will be video recorded and available on the website after the event. And there will be live simultaneous interpretation into Russian. And so I would recommend that you select from the button at the base of your screen your language, English or Russian. So before we progress into the program, I'd like to say today's event actually touches on a very important issue, not only in Kazakhstan, but around the world, and which is, shall we call it, a pragmatic balance. President Tokayev has made two announcements in recent months. One, a target of carbon neutrality in Kazakhstan by 2060, but also the need for enhancing long-term investment attractiveness in the oil and gas sector in the country. Perhaps we'll hear more of this from the panel in due course. So our moderator today, we'd like to welcome back Micheal Denison. Micheal is a group political advisor with BP and has been in that position, well, nearly 10 years. He's worked on Central Asia over 30 years in academic, policy, and commercial capacities. Over to you, Micheal.
Thank you very much, David, and good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to everyone attending today's session. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating the call today. I think it's, like David, I think it's really good timing. The energy sector in Kazakhstan is at a really interesting moment. Obviously, the big three upstream projects are still dominating in terms of reserves and production and exports, but that's definitely not the whole story in Kazakhstan. We've seen volumes of shale gas production almost double in the past decade. There's a complex story around transit and the expansion of oil pipeline capacity and domestic gasification. And probably more relevant to this discussion, there's a lot going on as well in the policy space with the very well received 2018 tax code, and also Kazakhstan playing an increasingly prominent role in OPEC plus discussions as well. And of course, there's the wider context of the energy transition, where challenges and opportunities may be emerging for the production of renewable energy and in the supply of critical minerals for renewable energy projects outside of Kazakhstan. So to help us understand these developments, we've assembled a very strong panel of experts who have great expertise and they're balanced between different disciplines. So I think we'll have a really good discussion. First of all, I'd like to say we're delighted to welcome Mr. Azamat Amrin, Vice Minister of National Economy of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Thank you very much, Minister Amrin, for joining us today. He formerly headed the Department of Tax and Customs Policy in the Ministry of National Economy and was also a district governor in Kazakhstan. So a warm welcome to you today. The Minister will be joined by four other panelists. Kate Mallinson will need no introduction to most of you. She runs PRISM, which is Europe's leading Central Asia risk consultancy. And she's been helping Western companies do business in the region for over 25 years. Kate's also an associate fellow at Chatham House. We're delighted to welcome Iskander Akylbayev as well. He's Executive Director of the Kazakhstan Council on International Relations, and without question, one of Kazakhstan's leading political experts. He's held a number of senior corporate and think tank positions in Kazakhstan, including Senior Fellow at the Institute of Diplomacy at the Academy of Public Administration under the President of Kazakhstan. Petr Konstantinov is the EBRD's regional head responsible for power sector projects in Turkey and Kazakhstan. And he's worked at the bank for 13 years on projects across the region. He trained as a mathematician at Moscow State University and also in finance from Moscow's New Economic School, so he comes with great credentials. And finally, last but not least, John Gorthrop is chief editor of FSU Energy for Argus Media, the foremost energy publisher on the region. He has a deep and long-standing background of reporting on Eurasian energy issues at Argus. So if we get our facts wrong, he'll be the man to set us straight. So I'm going to press on and introduce Kate first. I will ask speakers to stick to a 5 to 7 minute slot to leave time for questions at the end. And in the interest of efficiency, please, audience, could you type your questions into the chat box as we go along, and then I will field them for the Q&A, just to minimize the time spent moving from one speaker to another. So, Kate, would you like to set the scene for us?
Okay. Thank you, Michael, for the warm welcome, and to BKS for inviting me again on your webinar. As a specialist on energy politics in Kazakhstan, I'm going to say a few words on the recent elections before moving on to introduce the interesting topic of how Kazakhstan, the 12th largest producer of oil globally and a country largely dependent on coal-fired power stations to generate electricity, is getting on with moving towards decarbonisation. In January, as widely anticipated, the ruling Nur Otan party secured a comfortable victory in the legislative elections, winning 70% of the seats. The authorities went to considerable efforts to limit engagement in the elections, with no legitimate opposition force participating and no organised protest movement. Election day passed pretty uneventfully. Following the elections, Prime Minister Askar Mamin was reappointed after First President Nursultan Nazarbayev publicly called for his reinstatement, preempting an announcement by President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Majlis Speaker Nurlan Nigmatulin was also reappointed, as was the Cabinet of Ministers, with only 2 minor changes. Former President Nazarbayev's daughter, Dariga Nazarbayeva, was also elected to the Majlis. This electoral process suggests continuity and caution in Kazakhstan today. With the world in flux, with rising global populist disaffection crystallized by the pandemic, the Kazakh government's priority was getting through the elections without any disturbance. Last year, because of a perfect storm of lower commodity prices, reduced demand, and the COVID pandemic, GDP fell further than it's ever done in any economic crisis in Kazakhstan before, including 1998 and 2008 and 2015. It fell from 4% pre-crisis to minus 2.7%. Given these difficult headwinds, Prime Minister Mamin and Speaker Nigmatulin are considered competent and loyal and well suited to continue this course of modus operandi. The Kazakh government has managed the pandemic, the impact of it, very well. It's relied on increased borrowing and the national fund to maintain the national budget. And the Republic is set for an economic recovery this year, with GDP expectations to grow from 2.8 to 4%. And the Republic's creditors and international ratings agencies are pretty bullish on the country's macroeconomic management. The national fund remains in a strong position, and while debt will rise, it won't reach more than 30%, which is an eminently manageable sum. In this new era of decarbonisation, Kazakhstan faces challenges like any oil-dependent jurisdiction. Since independence, the primary driver of growth has been oil exports, with oil contributing as much as 60% of its total exports. And revenue from the oil industry continues to grow as a share of the national budget. And it's a hard call for a country like Kazakhstan to wean itself off commodities, of which it still has plenty. And despite its reserves, which provide the security of supply, Kazakhstan has made notable strides in its commitments to its transition to a green economy. It is a signatory of both the Kyoto Protocol and also the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2013, then President Nazarbayev adopted a national concept for the transition to a green economy, which sets targets for renewable energy production. The initial target was to reach 3% renewable energy within its energy production mix by 2020, and this target was just about achieved last year. And the concept outlines a plan to reach 10% by 2030 and ultimately 50% by 2050. We're now awaiting with bated breath the Republic's Decarbonisation 2050 strategy, which should come out over the next few months and will be very important in driving the green agenda. However, despite being endowed with optimum conditions for wind and solar, the Republic's green agenda faces immense challenges, given the relative cost of renewable energy compared with coal, which is abundant and cheaper to produce, and the wealth of existing energy infrastructure in Kazakhstan. Implementing an energy transition risks increasing utility prices for consumers at a time when living standards have fallen. And furthermore, there are oil and gas and coal lobbies that resist the energy transition in Kazakhstan. The Kazakh state oil and gas champion Kazmunaygas has yet to announce any decarbonisation plans, unlike its peers globally. And decarbonisation messages sometimes seem to have trouble trickling down within the ministries. To meet the Republic's Paris commitment to a 15% reduction on 1990 carbon emissions by 2030, Kazakhstan is going to have to significantly increase its decarbonisation activities. Investors such as the international finance institutions, we'll hear more from Petr later, and the international oil companies are also decarbonising their portfolios, which threatens major sources of investment for the Republic at a time when it is most needed. Since independence, despite much rhetoric about its intentions, Kazakhstan has failed to diversify away from commodities. The question is now whether the government, in its current cautious stance, is able to rise to the decarbonisation reform challenge. As mentioned earlier, President Tokayev announced in December this year at the UN Climate Ambition Summit that Kazakhstan intends to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. That's 10 years later than neighbouring Uzbekistan, which is already talking gigawatts and not megawatts. Some observers think that's not enough and that decarbonisation has to become more systematic in Kazakhstan. The proof will very much be in the 2050 decarbonisation strategy, where it'll be good to see renewed commitment to renewable energy sources, and also in the implementation and cascading of the rhetoric down to the ministries and the SOEs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. Some really interesting points there, particularly about the fabulous endowment that Kazakhstan has in its mineral wealth, which acts as a disincentive to change. But renewable energy, of course, requires land and space, and Kazakhstan's got plenty of that. So that is a big asset for the country. I'd like to now move on to Iskander Akylbayev to take the next slot. So Iskander, if you'd like to begin your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me for this very timely and very important topic of how climate actually affects business and politics in general sense. As my background, I focus mostly on geopolitical aspects of Eurasia, and I mostly speak about the geopolitical trends and how it affects climate dynamics and specifically where Kazakhstan stands in this global picture. So taking into account the recent trends for 10 years, we see the great debates and great negotiation process which are going on in the global affairs. The Paris Agreement, the climate summit run by United Nations, World Economic Forum, they all are talking about the climate as one of the most important aspects of global politics. And these aspects around climate will actually shape global affairs in the next maybe 10 or 20 years. So if you look at the recent report by World Economic Forum, they actually map out 10 risks which will affect the global affairs, and 5 out of those risks belongs to the climate change. And that's why the Davos meeting, which was held, the latest one is called as a climate conference. And it's very understandable that this cycle of events that tracks us down to the climate is actually speak about what's happening around the global heavyweights like China, US, European Union, Russia in the climate direction. And if you look at the UN Climate Summit, the general agenda was to be carbon neutral by 2060, and Kazakhstan kind of fully agrees with this stance. And this is very interesting that China, for example, has actually pioneered in the recent events to be one of this environment-friendly actions. On other side, the US has had different kind of view during the Trump administration and just withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And with the new administration in the US, they tried to be back in for the Paris conference. And the COVID-19, if from the global scale, actually made its stamped its mark. So according to the World Bank, 7%, we see the drop down of emissions, global emissions for 7%. And that's why the COVID-19 actually affected businesses in the oil and gas sector. And this is can be a very big challenge, but at the same time, it shows us a different alternative opportunity that we are actually able to work in very challenging environment and in very challenging context. But at the same time, with these some pros in this respect. So the global dynamics and global affairs is very important to understand how like developing states like Kazakhstan should work in this reality, or at the same time how business should react or address those challenges in their risk management. So coming to the Central Asia from the global scale, we understand that Central Asia in most of the 5 countries is landlocked and developing states. And there are 2 types of countries as downstream and bottom stream countries. Kazakhstan at the same time is from the bottom stream country, and we are certainly very much dependent on the climate. For example, 44 or 45% of our water resources are coming outside of Kazakhstan, and that's why we are dependent on building a very constructive dialogues with our neighboring countries. So the water security and water management is one of the key parameters for Central Asia climate kind of dialogue. And I believe one of those recommendations for regional cooperation in Central Asia and specifically for Kazakhstan is building a strategic and a constructive platform for regional cooperation specifically on a climate dialogue. And I believe this is a very important time because if you look at the context and the recent events, there is an increasing drought and we are losing annually approximately 94 billion tenge or because of the drought in Central Asia, and Kazakhstan is seeing the echoes of that risks. If you look at the 5 key cities in Central Asia, coming from Almaty, Ashgabat, Tashkent, Bishkek, and Dushanbe, all of these 5 important economic cities in our region are subject to earthquake, for example. And that's why environment and natural risks, natural disasters are very much important for national economies in the region. That's why building up mechanisms for risk awareness or reaction committees, specifically, or building a collective mechanisms on regional cooperation on the climate is very important. So it's not only important for oil and gas sector, but also for national security and national economy. That's why Afghanistan as a neighboring state for Central Asia is also important, and they have their own issues, specifically on the water security droughts. And that's why there is another point coming to my mind is climate migration, which is very important these days. So we usually speak about migrants through the level of political aspects or military aspects, like what's happening in Middle East, for example, coming to the Europe, migrants coming to Europe. But itself, I think it's more important to speak about climate migrants. And I think this is a very underrepresented topic in the climate discussions. And coming to the specifically Kazakhstan, I believe Kazakhstan in this respect has gradually been developing its climate strategy. And as our previous speaker has stressed about the 2050 strategy and Kazakhstan's pledge to be carbon neutral by 2060 is an important signal for business who are trying to invest in Kazakhstan. And this is important for big companies to increase their standards who are investing into the Kazakhstan. So by increasing business standards, being eco-friendly in this respect will push Kazakhstan and their partners, economic partners, to come to the same platform just to build a common mechanisms. That's why I believe that the global dynamics which are happening around the world, the regional aspect in Central Asia and the local economy and local stance on global dynamics, it's very important to understand how Kazakhstan is approaching the climate dialogue. And I believe this question is open to discussion and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iskander. I think that's a really important point about regional cooperation. That's something where the region has definitely made progress in the last 5 years or so, partly because some of the neighbours want to do it more. And I think that's essential in actually meeting many of the challenges that you've described. So thanks very much. Our next speaker is the Minister, Mr. Amrin. If you would like to take the floor, Minister, we'd be looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. Good day, dear participants of today's webinar. Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers of this webinar for this opportunity to speak before you and to tell you about what we're doing and how we're influencing and impacting the energy sector. Clearly, oil and gas and mining sector is a big portion or plays an important role in our economy. The taxes and other payments that are collected from subsoil users is the the overwhelming share of the budget. However, the government is doing a lot for the various sectors. However, I would like to speak about taxation issues, taxation policies in mining sector. In Kazakhstan, we have always paid a lot of attention to taxation of subsoil users. The goal of such taxation is to have a balance to ensure the maximum tax collection to the budget and to ensure the best options for the subsoil users. Well, historically looking, Kazakhstan has been gradually shifting towards the principles of subsoil user taxation that exist in some developed countries. You remember that there was a law and tax code on subsoil users. There was some kind of special treatment, special agreements concluded where the taxation, the rules of taxation for subsoil users have been developed in 1995. There was a separate chapter. There were two models. The one actually working on the effective legislation. The second model was the product sharing agreement, kind of a share of the Republic of Kazakhstan, regulating that aspect. The time was moving on, everything was progressing. There were some changes in 2001 made to tax code. In 2009, we passed the new tax code. And it was in 2009 when the new tax code that we have introduced the most significant changes in taxation of subsoil users. Well, we have moved away, kind of shifted from the product sharing agreement. It was abolished or cancelled as a model of taxation, but the contract that have been concluded till before the 1st of January 2009, product sharing agreement actually will remain effective, and they will stay effective until the expiry or termination date. So we, in fact, changed the red taxation on oil and on condensate. So depending on actual market situation, the market prices, actually, we had the scale depending on the market prices. We sort of indexed it towards that international and global prices. There was a royalty. We have replaced that by the mineral extraction tax, and the estimates of the minerals extracted is based on the global, again, the world market, depending on the volume. The rates were directly reflected, kind of regulated by the tax code. Also, some basic principles of separate taxation or tax accounting has been introduced per every individual contract or beyond contract activity, and that was the foundation for building a system of revenue distribution and setting up the tax boundaries. Besides that, the government kind of kept the right to apply specific taxation, kind of differentiated tax tariffs to some specific kind of subsoil users who worked on some very difficult or complex situations, especially in the mining area. The work is still ongoing. I mean, there's still been improvements. Clearly, it has been said today that in order to attract investment, we need some simplified mechanism, something plain and understandable. And we, of course, are thinking about that, and we see that as a challenge, as a goal. And it all pushed us, kind of motivated us to introduce an alternative subsoil user tax as an annex to the existing contract. We made it for under the water, offshore and deep waters drilling subsoil users. Actually, it's different, this alternative tax, from the traditional subsoil user tax because it's based on the cost. However, the alternative tax is the difference between the cumulative annual revenue less with some deductions. So the profitability of the contract for this particular type of the tax is calculated. So the alternative tax is applied after all the expenses have been deducted. So only once the subsoil begins generating profits, and I mean, after deductions, there is still some revenue left. That is what is being taxed. And this alternative tax has substituted the super profit tax, the historical expenses tax. We had some retro tax and the subsoil user tax. So instead of the 4 tax, we have now 1 single tax, but it's called the alternative tax that has been introduced recently. However, there is one reservation or caveat. Like I said, it's for offshore and for deep water kind of drilling operations, because if you compare those with the onshore operations, then it's more expensive and very capital intensive. But in order to stimulate and motivate the onshore geo-service, and that will also be regulated by law, we will be introducing an alternative tax for onshore drilling and onshore operations as well, not only for offshore or deep water drilling, but for regular subsoil user. We will be introducing and foreseeing an alternative tax. Also, in order to stimulate and motivate the geological service, we have actually canceled the bonus of commercial discovery for all subsoil usage contracts. So this tax, now this kind of bonus of discovery, served as a kind of penalty for a successful survey, and in fact it's kind of threatened or scared the investors, because an investor, I believe, should be rewarded for finding the field, the minefield. And in order to stimulate the geo survey, we decided to abstain from applying this tax. Also, since 2018, the new tax code has changed the approach slightly. It began kind of taking responsibility for a failed survey. The subsoil users, those engaged in the geological service, are entitled to deduct some of its expenses from the taxing base, not higher than 20%. So if those expenses are within the 25% of the total amount of expenses related to the field, are now allowed to be deducted from the taxing base. So a right has been foreseen to transfer some expenses when allocating the contract area. Okay, so-called the blurring of the boundaries between the surveyed site with the extraction or production site. So there are lots of other issues. So we have the Foreign Investors Council in Kazakhstan, as you know, that raises lots of issues related to subsoil usage and taxation. And under, in line with that work, we are thinking about some targeted, some specific tax benefits, releasing or exempting from land tax or property tax. We also, like I said, we wanted to apply alternative subsoil user tax to the onshore operations, also to review the scale of the taxing, also introduce an uplift up to 50%. So all of that for the new contracts, or is this foreseen for the new contracts in order to push and to motivate, to drive the geological service. It has been mentioned earlier that diversification is important. And to pursue diversification, we have so-called strategic investment contracts instruments, so-called. That is exactly a simplified mechanism that I mentioned. When under that kind of strategic investment contract, a certain package of preferences is foreseen, thanks to which the investor will find it beneficial to work and to operate in the country. And we will, of course, be looking and evaluating the economic aspect of the project. We are looking at the investment, looking at the ROI, etc. And given all the economic characteristics of a particular contract, we will be, fine-tuning the taxation and fine-tuning the preferences granted to the investor. This issue is work in progress, but I believe that soon a piece of legislation will be passed to kind of regulate, to kind of solidify all these issues. However, when it comes to the local investors, we're working a lot with local associations, oil and gas producers associations, in order to move forward in this direction. And it has been very correctly mentioned that we need decarbonization, that we need alternative sources of energy. A lot is being done, and in there as well. There are some stimulating packages, to drive the solar and wind power generation. There are 3 economic zones, which again have special benefits and special preferences, tax preferences, namely tax exemption, to develop this alternative or renewable sources of energy. Well, that is it. That's all I wanted to say. Should you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for setting out so comprehensively the clear and progressive agenda that Kazakhstan has. What I'd like to do is now just quickly invite people to file questions into the Q&A box as we go along, please. We've got one already, but please think about your questions and add them in now so that we can go straight to the questions. So thank you. Our next speaker is Petr Konstantinov from the EBRD, the Regional Head Power Sector Project. So Petr, please, you start your presentation now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. It's my pleasure to participate in this interesting discussion. I have to apologize. I have some tree cutting happening outside, so there might be some background noise. I hope it won't be too disturbing. So I'm sure most of you are aware of EBRD, a multilateral financier and one of the largest foreign investors in Kazakhstan. So I won't go into the details of our operations. But just to illustrate the point of politics versus economy, I work at the banking department of EBRD, and my job is to find and finance projects that fit into the bank's mandate, and most importantly, will pay the money back. So we are projects-driven bank. However, as part of our business model, we also engage in what we call policy dialogue. So we advocate for improvements in the regulations that will address specific issues through creation of right environment for good projects to actually happen. To give you an example, back in 2009, EBRD started policy dialogue in Kazakhstan to promote renewable energy. Back then, it seemed more of a science fiction, but yeah, this emerging sector was embraced in the long-term political vision. Kate mentioned in 2013, Kazakhstan came up with a national concept of green economy, and then renewable support framework was introduced shortly after. The economy didn't dictate any necessity for the renewable energy at the time. It was a political decision, and it turned out to be a great success. Fast forward to 2021, Kazakhstan now has 1.6 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity that was built just in a few years. And that's about 10% of available capacity in the country. So that's a remarkable achievement. And by the way, EBRD financed half of that capacity, so we do put our money where our mouth is. So in just a few years, Kazakhstan established a whole new industry, expertise, attracted new foreign investors, but most importantly, created a showcase for clean energy potential in the country. Operational projects proved that climate conditions are not a problem. In fact, gave us a much better understanding of the vast resource potential in the country, and which it has for both wind and solar. In 2018, Kazakhstan introduced an auction system for awarding renewable projects. And prices kept going down each year. To put things into perspective, back in 2015, solar tariff was about 7 times higher than wholesale electricity tariff. In November 2020, the winning bids came out less than 2 times more expensive than wholesale levels. Again, this is a remarkable result. There's always been a notion that Kazakhstan's coal is the cheapest source of electricity and nothing will ever beat it. Nominally, without all the externalities of climate impact, health impact, etc., it's still cheap, but technological advances in renewable energy technology are quickly closing this gap to become the cheapest source of energy, even in Kazakhstan. So, thanks to this good political influence back in 2013, we probably will see very soon economy influencing decisions on investments in renewables, and they will drive evolution of energy sector towards renewables. Another example we already see is there is more and more interest from industrial players, including, by the way, oil and gas companies, in corporate PPAs. So this would be bilateral, unsubsidized contracts that will be used to offset corporate carbon footprint, but also will provide a reasonably priced energy solution on a purely economic basis. Now, there are, of course, climate and environmental angles. Issues ranging from air pollution and associated public health implications in large cities, water scarcity, desertification exacerbated by climate change, as we previously mentioned. So it is not surprising that President Tokayev is continuously raising these matters in his public statements. It is also not surprising that Kazakhstan committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. This is another example where politics will influence energy business. The decarbonization agenda will trigger energy transition in Kazakhstan, and while 2060 is very far away, concrete steps need to be planned and implemented today. EBRD is looking to support Kazakhstan in this work, and specifically in the electricity and gas sector, to define the low-carbon pathway, which will guide sector evolution in the coming decades. As you know, under the Paris Agreement, peaking of emissions need to happen as early as possible, with a downward trend afterwards. As the electricity consumption continues to increase steadily in Kazakhstan, even during 2020, despite COVID, thorough modeling and planning exercise will be needed to balance the power system needs, decarbonization agenda, and economic realities. So the invite for this event mentioned the conflict between oil and gas and decarbonization agenda. As most of oil majors are embracing carbon neutrality, the embedded conflict is probably going towards a constructive cooperation. The fact that Kazakhstan also committed to carbon neutrality provides a clear guidance to local players so that they can develop their own decarbonization pathways. On the countrywide scale, Kazakhstan might actually offer interesting prospects, particularly for the gas sector. Role of gas is in the energy transition is subject to an ongoing debate, but in Kazakhstan, coal-fired power plants supplying both electricity and heat represent a significant decarbonization obstacle, and gas could become a bridging solution. 70% of the power generation is attributed to base load, inflexible coal-fired power plants, which makes deployment of large-scale renewables difficult. New maneuverable gas generation could facilitate growth in renewables in the medium term until energy storage solutions become more established and affordable. There is a caveat I have to make here. There is increasing reluctance to finance fossil fuel projects. Some of the speakers mentioned this as well. And hence, low carbon pathway planning is crucial to ensure that any new gas infrastructure fits into this broader plan, not result in high carbon intensity and bears manageable risk of becoming a stranded asset. In conclusion, I would like to say that while the decarbonization agenda and climate change threat seem daunting, we should not forget the extraordinary technological advances achieved in the energy sector in recent years. Speed of innovation and accelerating change in what used to be a rather traditional business gives basis for optimism and creates new opportunities, which I hope will translate in more good green projects in Kazakhstan that the EBRD will be able to support. Thank you.
Thank you, Petr. I think it's really interesting that you highlighted the importance of policy design, particularly in the electricity market, as one of the ways in which the transition agenda can be really developed. So I'm sure that's something we'll come back to in our questions. We've got a few questions coming in, starting to come in now. Please, could you continue to think about and file your questions as we move to our last speaker, John Gawthrop. John, would you like to give your presentation now, please?
Certainly would. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Michael, for your introduction. And thank you to the British-Kazakh Society for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm going to be speaking to you about oil and gas in Kazakhstan, where things stand now and where they're likely to head in the short to medium term and long term too. So the past year has been quite a roller coaster for the global oil and gas industry. As an illustration of what this means for Kazakhstan, the outright price for CPC blend crude, which accounts for about 60% of Kazakhstan's exports, stood at $67 a barrel at the start of last year. By the 21st of April, it had fallen to an astonishing low of $5.54 after the collapse of the first OPEC plus output restraint agreement, and against the background of the COVID-19 pandemic and decimation of oil demand around the world. Now, prices did subsequently revive thanks to the renewal of the OPEC plus agreement. Particularly from November last year, there was a fairly steady climb, taking us to the mid-60s, $60 per barrel in the middle of this month, on the hopes of global economic recovery. But things have actually come off a bit in recent days, so the situation is still really quite volatile. We are at an interesting juncture now in terms of where Kazakhstan's crude production is going, crude and condensate production. The country remains constrained by its participation in the OPEC plus agreement, but is already looking beyond that. So recently, the liquids output forecast, crude and gas condensate output forecast for 2021 was raised to 86 million tons. That's about 1.8 million barrels a day. Previously, the forecast was 83.4 million tons. That upward revision follows the 4th of March OPEC plus meeting, at which Kazakhstan was granted an additional 20,000 barrel a day quota, crude oil production quota for April, which will take its allowance up to 1.46 million barrels a day. That's crude excluding condensate. On the 5th of March, the day after the meeting, Kazakh Energy Minister, Mr. Nurlanbagayev, said the increase takes into account gradual recovery in the global oil market and prices. But obviously, the outlook for that recovery is very much dependent on what happens with the COVID-19 pandemic and progress of vaccination rollouts around the world. And the outlook for this seems to be changing on an almost weekly basis. So things are still quite unstable, I would say. On the same day, the minister said that the government, the Kazakh government, and NCOC, that's the Shell ENI-led consortium that operates the giant offshore Kashagan field, are aiming to finalize a plan for a second development phase by the end of this year. Now, during the course of the OPEC plus agreements, Kazakh compliance with its production limits has never been especially strong, and Kashagan is partly the reason why. The initial OPEC plus agreement was signed in November 2016, just after Kashagan was finally commissioned, following a 3-year delay because of gas pipeline leaks after a short-lived start in the autumn of 2013. And it actually came online 10 years late overall. So at that time, when Kazakhstan first signed up for OPEC plus, the then energy minister, Mr. Bozembayev, described participation as being purely symbolic. Basically, the need to get Kashagan up and running after its precarious restart meant that Kazakhstan was not in a position to hold back output. Under the latest iteration of OPEC+, Kazakhstan has been under more scrutiny and compliance has been a bit tighter. Even so, it only managed to hit its quota during 1 month, that January of this year. And production from Kashagan remains well below its 400,000 barrel a day capacity, suggesting that there has been some constraint. On the subject of Kashagan expansion, we haven't heard a great deal in recent years, and indeed we haven't heard a great deal over the past decade. It had become quite a contentious issue after the delays and cost overruns associated with stage 1, bringing Kashagan into production, which cost in the end $55 billion, triple early forecasts for it. So the last time that the expansion of Kashagan was discussed actively was probably 10 years ago. And then the focus was very much on the Kazakh government urging NCOC to cut costs from the initially projected $68 billion. Phase 2 then ended up being kicked into the long grass amid the debacle of the first attempt to launch Kashagan in 2013. As of now, there's no time scale and there are no cost parameters for the expansion of Kashagan. But based on earlier discussions, earlier parameters, we could be looking at an increase in production of about 1 million barrels a day over 2 to 3 years. So if a decision is reached on moving ahead at the end of this year, we could be looking at an extra 1 million barrels a day from Kashagan by the mid-2020s. And there's more crude coming. Kashagan's not the only show in town as far as expanding output goes. At the Tengiz field, the biggest producing field in Kazakhstan, there's a $40 billion expansion project underway, now about 80% complete, that is due to take production to over 800,000 barrels a day by 2022 from around 560,000 barrels a day now. Work on this was slowed by COVID outbreaks at the field among the workforce last year, but the pace does seem to be picking up now. Elsewhere, the picture is less bullish. Tengiz, Kashagan, Karachaganak, the big PSA projects aside, most of Kazakhstan's crude oil fields are mature with declining production. There is talk of new licensing rounds to bring new fields on, but there's little concrete information available on that so far. Kazakhstan's also talked about something called the Eurasia project, targeting deep onshore reserves. Potential reserves figures are like 455 billion barrels, astonishing level of reserves mentioned. A few years ago, ENI, Rosneft, CNPC, SOCAR signed an initial agreement to study the project, but we haven't heard too much about that since. In the interim, back in 2019, NCOC dropped out of or decided against developing Kalamas Moria field, which is part of the Kashagan PSA, citing complicated economics. And Shell pulled out of the Khazar project, which it was planning to develop with Kazmunai gas and Oman oil. Complex shallow water project, potentially high costs because of the need to build artificial islands for production, as was done at Kashagan. So to sort of wrap things up, the environment in Kazakhstan, or generally in the global oil industry, is now very different to when those 3 mega projects in Kazakhstan were conceived and for much of their operational period. Obviously, we had US shale disrupting global markets in the years since then, and now we have rising concerns about climate change, which obviously we've already heard quite a bit about, forcing the pace of change to transition to cleaner energy sources, and certainly forcing the pace of discussion about that. Assuming that the OPEC Plus restrictions are lifted in a year from now as scheduled, and that Kazakh crude production continues or begins to rise, there could be quite a lot of extra oil hitting a market where the appetite for crude and also the appetite for investment in new upstream projects could be waning. The past couple of decades, we've moved away from a world in which the main concern about oil production was keeping up with demand to one where concerns are centered around whether demand will actually match production potential. And this is going to be a big challenge for Kazakhstan and indeed all producers of oil. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, John. That's really good. And it's a dilemma shared with other big producers as well. You know, how do you monetize? What do you do to monetize your assets in a world where there might be a finite life for oil and gas projects? We've got about 10 minutes. I'd like to just press on with questions. We've got 3 or 4 questions. The first question is to the Minister, and I'll just repeat that very quickly. Which tax preferences, in addition to those already provided by legislation or in special economic zones, are planned for green projects, including renewable energy sources? Minister, would you like to take that question? I believe that it's written in Russian as well in the chat box if you want to have another look at it.
Да, спасибо за вопрос. Как вы правильно заметили, у нас есть несколько инструментов.
Thank you for your question. As you have correctly mentioned, we have several instruments, such as free economic zone, where we already have some benefits and advantages for kind of renewable sources of energy producers. On top of that, we have a tool called the investment priority contracts. That's kind of a special agreement or a contract under which some benefits are granted on corporate tax, on property tax, or land tax for a period of 10 years. We are considering these opportunities at the moment, and we hope that this instrument will help us, grant some benefits. The thing is that actually the special economic zones or the free economic zone, they are connected to the territorial administrative unit with Almaty or other region. However, if we have this special kind of priority contract, they will be applied or granted irrespective of the territorial location of a project. The second one is a methane gas of coal layers. We have the ArcelorMittal company that extracts lots of coal and lots of kind of ore, but with lots of gas as well, kind of adjacent gas coming together with the coal. We need to handle kind of extracting that gas and processing that. There are some companies, there are some bids and proposals that are being made, and it has already been regulated by law. Well, all in all, we have the sectoral ministry, Ministry of Industry and Development, who is responsible for this very issue. We are in close collaboration with the ministry. Well, the thing is, there's a procedure. I mean, there is a specific procedure. We need to make some estimates. We need to come up with some economic models. And given all that all that work, we will be applying this instrument, the one that I mentioned. There's another big tool that has already been regulated by the law, an investment strategic contract. However, the volume of investment needs to be significant, more than $50 million. Yeah. However, there are some already benefits that are being granted. There are some, preferences, exemption from corporate tax, from property tax. However, for the priority investor contract, that's 10-year period. But for this kind of strategic investor contract, the period of such exemption is 25 years. So should there be any interesting projects, we could really consider and we could apply this tool directly.
I'm going to move straight on because we've got 3 or 4 questions to deal with. And I'm going to go to Petr. You may have seen the question in the chat box, Petr, about the EBRD. Would you like to make a quick comment on how you're viewing the renewable energy market outside of the auctions?
Yeah, so generally speaking, corporate PPAs is a great way forward for the renewable energy space, and we are keen to support it. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we do see some ideas about this type of projects flying around. It's been going for some time, but they're becoming more and more concrete and more economically justified. So I do hope that we will see more of those coming online in Kazakhstan in the next couple of years. And yeah, we would support this development.
Thank you very much, Petr. Question from Nick Coleman about how do the panelists assess the willingness of NCOC partners to carry out Kashagan expansion, given the caution prevalent in the industry? You touched on this, John. Would you like to just make a comment on that point?
Mr. Gawthrop, your mic is muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion over the next year. I wouldn't put big money on a conclusion being reached by the end of the year and things moving ahead. I think that it very much will depend on the outlook for global economy, the oil price, and so on. If we stay where we are now in terms of prices, then I think it's feasible that some form of expansion may take place. But if we see another year of volatility, I think that the issue is likely to be pushed down the road a little bit. You know, bearing in mind the lengthy delays that have been associated with Kashagan all along, I think that although, you know, I touched on the idea that the second phase could be launched and that we might see extra production by, you know, the middle of the current decade, I think that's really very much best case scenario, and I suspect that it may be pushed out further.
Thanks very much, John. We've got a question on hydrogen. I don't know who would want to take that one. That covers quite a big area about the potential for hydrogen. Do we have any volunteers for this? Petr, is the EBRD working on hydrogen?
Yeah, we're certainly following the developments of hydrogen very actively, and we are engaging with some of the clients, but not yet in Kazakhstan, on helping them to develop their hydrogen strategies. So I would think that in Kazakhstan there is good potential for hydrogen, particularly as there is plenty of gas networks already in place. So Kaztransgas could be, I think, one entity championing the idea. And going forward, this hydrogen technology matures and becomes more affordable. I think similarly to other places, Kazakhstan will use it to decarbonize some of the more difficult sectors.
Thank you. A question for the minister, if he's able to answer this. There's a question about training of people in Kazakhstan to work in the new forms of energy, so decarbonization technologies. Is the government working on the issue of training for and employment in this sector?
Ну,
Well,
вопрос действительно интересный.
quite an interesting question. Yes, we are, as a government.
Люди, которые этим занимаются.
There are people in charge of that.
Более точно, наверное, сказать сейчас не смогу.
Well, I'm afraid I cannot give you more than that at the moment.
Есть информация.
Well, as far as I am aware, there are some training workshops and seminars available for this kind of new sectors of energy, and the work is ongoing, but that is all.
Thank you. I think we're at the top of the hour now. I apologise to those people whose questions we've not got round to, but thank you very much. As it's 12 o'clock in the UK now, I'm going to hand back to David for some closing words, but I'd just like to thank all the panelists for their presentations and the answers to the questions that they gave.
Thank you, Michael, and I will second that. Thank everyone for their participation, particularly, of course, the moderator, but everybody's interventions. That they've been, I mean, really excellent today. Also, I'd like to thank the people that you don't see here, which is Alijan Akylbayev from the BKS, who's excellently handles the behind-the-scenes aspects of the webinar, and we've had Gaini Nukabayeva interpreting in Almaty and Yelena McAfee in London. Finally, just like to mention the future BKS events. In April, we'll have financial services, agribusiness in May, and in particular with today's audience, on June the 8th, we have another oil, gas and renewables event, which will be focused on decarbonization in Kazakhstan and chaired by Aida Sidikova from the EBRD. So that's something to particularly look forward to. In addition, there'll be a number of other webinars related to 30 years of Kazakhstan's independence. So with that, I encourage you to look at our keep track on the website, and look forward to seeing you at the future BKS events, as well as joining the society if you have not already done so. So thank you all. Keep safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.